The most sought after rewards for doing well at the big Yu-Gi-Oh tourneys has always been undoubtedly the prize cards. These unique cards not only go for a lot of money, but they're also often unavailable for the rest of the player base for quite a while up until they get a reprint. On today's episode of the Unknown Side of YuGiOh, we'll be going over the SGC prize cards, as well as the impact they've had in the game due to their power and exclusivity. The first card we'll be going over is Cyber-Stein. This is a level 2 Dark Machine monster with meager stats, but its effect lets you pay 5,000 life points to special summon any fusion monster from your extra deck in attack position. Cyber-Stein was the first unique prize card we got, all the way back in 2004. Back then, the main Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments were still the Shonen Jump Championship Series, or SJCs. These were the only official large-scale events for the game and were held throughout the USA and Canada. Because there was not yet an equivalent for these tourneys in Europe in 2004, Stein was only exclusive to the winners of a few tournaments. It was also exclusive to America, despite having been released originally as a common all the way back in '99 for the OCG. Stein saw some play in Japan due to being one of the first few ways to access the extra deck. But due to its staggered release in the West, it actually didn't have any impact as a prize card at first. This is because both Metamorphosis and Magical Scientist were available by the time Stein was released, and they did a better job at utilizing the good fusion monsters from the time, especially Thousand Eyes Restrict, without a 5,000 life point cost. Still, in the following years, not only would these options get banned, but Cyber-Stein would also become available to the player base at large due to a reprint. However, as if this wouldn't be enough to make it playable, we would also see the release of the two best Stein targets only a month after that, Cyber End Dragon and Cyber Twin Dragon. These two were both beaters with huge stats that could pierce and attack twice respectively, allowing you to go for game out of nowhere. From this point on, Stein would begin to see play in almost every deck, with Cyber-Stein OTK being a strategy that used the card as its main win con. The goal was to stall the game with floodgates like Level Limit Area B and Gravity Bind up until they could draw a back row sweeper, Stein, and something to make Stein represent lethal, at which point they'd just clear the field and go for lethal. It also became somewhat popular around this time for burn decks to play a 15-card Cyber-Stein OTK conversion package into their side deck. Since both that deck and the burn shared the same floodgates, they could easily transform their whole strategy for games 2 and 3, which would make side decking against them extremely difficult. However, though these two weren't the only things around in the metagame, Cyber-Stein was still a factor in almost every deck. Most players would have at least a single copy to their main, since it was a valid search target for Sandgan and could be special summoned to the field very easily through either Premature Burial or Last Will. This meant that any random deck could very well turn any small lead into game by bringing out a huge threat when their opponent had no interaction. This went on for about a year, but it seems the last straw for Konami was when a dedicated Stein strategy took a 2006 Shonen Jump Championship by storm, at which point they decided to ban this card in an unprecedented emergency ban list, where it was actually the only hit. This means this is not only the first prize card, but it's also the first card to be emergency banned as well. This card stayed banned for well over 10 years, only being brought down to limited in 2019, where it would see some experimentation but without much success. Even though it now has a target as powerful as Nature Exterior, which can negate all spells and traps your opponent activates, it wasn't worth dedicating an extra deck slot for this one of, which took up your normal summon. Stein would pick up some steam when Tier Limits were around though, since it could be milled through chance through some of the regular plays, and then brought back from the graveyard with Sprite Elf, and then it could either bring out a Tier Fusion or the aforementioned Exterior. This was good enough to earn itself a spot in quite a few topping lists, but of course this stopped when Sprite Elf as well as Tier Limits in general were annihilated by the ban list. Nowadays, this card's only remaining niche outside of Genki FDKs is in a few machine decks where it can be searched off of Gear Giant X, and it might see play in Super Heavy Samurais once their new support drops. Even if it did not see much play before its reprint, this card's power and extensive history do make it more than worth being the first SJC prize card. The second prize card we got in the West was Des Volstgalph. This is a level 6 Earth Dragon with 2200 attack and 1700 defense, with the ability to inflict 500 damage to your opponent if it destroys an opponent's monster by battle. Additionally, each time a normal or quick play spell card resolves, it gains 200 attack until the end phase. It was in the year that Volstgalph came out that Konami would attempt to have an SJC equivalent for Europe, the Pharaoh Tour, which would be held in the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, and France. This was great news for the European players at the time, even if the prize card's quality wouldn't begin to match such a feat. Even for its time, Des Volstgalph was one of the most underwhelming tribute summons you could be making, as things like Monarchs and Jinzos were already available to everyone. This card's mediocre burn effect, coupled with a very minor attack boost, could make it into a playground staple at best, even though it was only available to the highest level competition for a long while. This one remained a prize card exclusive for almost 5 years before getting a commercially available printing, though this had zero impact on the game whatsoever. Still, this would end up being one of the only duds when it came to the SJC era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Prize cards, being the only card on the list whose sole quality was being hard to obtain back then, and having no reason to be liked outside of its brief appearance in the anime. Next up for 2006, we have Shrink. This is a quick play spell card which lets you target a face-up card in the field and make its attack become half its original value for this turn. Shrink was a pretty decent staple for its time as a heavily power-crept version of other attack-changing effects. Battle traps like Sakuretsu Armor had been seen a lot of play by the time this card was released, and though Shrink filled a similar role, it was also much more versatile. It could be used both when attacking and being attacked, could be chained to backward removal, and triggered during the damage step. The main problem behind this card was its synergy with Don Zalug and Hydrogen Dawn, both cards with pretty good effects if they win a battle. While Shrink does go pretty well with these cards, this single copy of it some top players had wasn't enough to boost these kind of strategies further than others, meaning the impact of the card being so exclusive was minimal. However, this wouldn't stop this card from being hyped by the player base at large, who eagerly awaited for a proper release. In early 2007, this card became available to everyone, and in that same year we would see the first strategy to be heavily associated with it, the gadgets. These monsters all had small bodies, with the biggest one maxed out at 1400. But they all shared the effect to add the gadget that matched their background color from their deck to the hand. They were all +1s at normal summon, which would then add another +1 on the following turn, something that had never been seen before in the game's history, and quickly became one of the most popular strategies around. Gadget decks had to max on all kinds of 1-for-1 removal, as their monsters would rarely, if ever, contest anything by themselves. And this is where Shrink shone. It allowed all gadgets to at least trade in battle even with the biggest monsters that were seen play, the Monarchs. Not only they'd often max out on Shrink, they'd often play the strictly inferior Rush Recklessly in addition to it as well. In the following years, just as the gadgets began to fall off, we got Gladiator Beast, another archetype which benefited greatly from this card. All the Glad Beast monsters get their effects off at the end of the battle phase if they've battled that turn, with these ranging from removal to generating advantage. This meant that the usual battle traps like Dimension Prison were often subpar in Gladiator Beast decks, as they'd much prefer to run Waboku and Shrink instead, letting you trigger your Glads even during your opponent's turn. This would be the last hurrah for this card, as from this point on, the battle phase would only become less and less relevant with time. Even if this card's relevancy while a prize card exclusive had been minimal, Konami would not disappoint the players with what came afterwards. Crush Card Virus would then be the prize card of choice from January to July of 2007. This is a normal trap card whose pre-errata effect lets you tribute a dark monster with 1000 or less attack to destroy all monsters with 1500 more attack from their hand, field, and also all cards they drew for the next 3 turns. Crush Card Virus was a truly broken card for its time, and the impact it had on the meta cannot be understated. Monsters with at least 1500 attack made up the majority of the metagame, accounting for a large variety of staples such as Cyber Dragons, Monarchs, Snipe Hunter, Chaos Monsters, etc, etc. And as if getting rid of every possible threat your opponent had wasn't enough, it could also give you full hand knowledge for the next 3 turns as well, as your opponent would have to show you their hand as well as everything they drew from then on. Resolving Crush Card Virus would almost always lead to a win. This made many people start building around the card, even as a one-of. This meant including more and more targets in their deck, such as Gravekeeper's Guard and Spirit Reaper, as games were slow enough to the point where you'd be able to see this card at least once a match. Diamond Dew Turbo was one of the most powerful decks around when this card's release, and this card only bolstered it further as one of their best cards. The pre-errata Disc Commander was also a fodder target for Crush Card Virus. This card led to the rich get richer kind of situation going around in the game, where people who'd won events before would have a higher chance to win future ones due to having Crush Card Virus. This would go on for the entirety of 2007, and would culminate in one of the few high-profile teams having access to this card, which they would of course only share amongst themselves. People were already complaining about the game being prohibitively expensive back then, but things would get much worse now, as Crush Card Virus was going from anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000. This culminated in 2008 when people would often want to combo Crush Card Virus with another prize card, Gold Sarcophagus, totaling in over $5,000 for 2 cards out of your 40-card deck. At this point, Dark Arm Dragon Turbo decks were dominating the metagame, and with that itself being a $200 card on release, the game had never been, and will hopefully never again, be as expensive as it was then. Things would get somewhat better as Crush Card got a reprint that year, but due to some supposed short printing, this card would still be costing you over $100 by itself. What followed was a whole year of Crush Card Virus omnipresence. Towards the middle of 2008, the meta would coalesce between Gladiator Beast, Lightsworn, and Dad decks, all of which played Crush Card Virus, and also lost extremely hard to it. We would see the years close with Teledad rising up as the best deck, and the card remained legal for the first half of 2009 before it was finally banned. Crush Card Virus was a real blight for the game from release all the way to this point, and though the worst thing about it was the time when it was the exclusive prize card, it had impacted several metas after that. Konami would eventually bring back Crush Card Virus with an errata in 2015 though. The card's new effect was much like the original one, except it would also prevent your opponent from taking damage until the end of the next turn after this card resolves, and also let your opponent destroy up to 3 monsters with 1500 more attack from their deck as part of its effect. This card was still strong in 2015, but it wasn't the instant win against everything but it used to be. Around this time, both Shadows and Burning Abyss were part of the metagame, each of which had pretty good crush card virus targets within their card pool. However, all other monsters would also float on destruction, making the card not nearly as powerful when it resolved. Not only that, but since the new errata would let you essentially Foolish Burial for 3, this meant getting hit by the new crush card virus would more often be a plus than anything else. Still, the card was by no means bad, as there was quite a few strategies which would get destroyed by it, such as Necros and Cleafort. This made Crush Card Virus go from an instant win button to a good side deck staple and nothing more. As the years passed, not only did graveyard effects become more prominent, but better side deck cards with easier activation requirements had become more popular, which would eventually make this card leave the meta and never come back again. Crush Card Virus remains as the strongest and most controversial prize card in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, which put the game in such a state that hopefully won't ever repeat itself again. The second prize card for 2007 was Gold Sarcophagus. This is a normal spell card which banishes one card from your deck when activated, and then adds it to your hand during the second standby phase after it was activated. Despite North America getting Crush Card Virus in the first half of the year, and then Gold Sarcophagus during the second half, this was actually the only prize card available in Europe during 2007, as they would skip on Crush Card Virus entirely until its reprint. This would also be the last one to be available on the content for a while, as the Pharaoh Tour which gave out Gold Sarcophagus was also the last one that took place. Either way, Gold Sarcophagus was yet another amazing staple from the time, locked behind either doing really well at a huge tourney or a crazy prize tag. Being able to search for anything in your deck was more than worth waiting for 2 turns. This was often used in conjunction with Crush Card Virus like previously mentioned, but it wasn't uncommon to go into your boss monster or any other similarly limited cards. Being yet another option which every deck at the time would run if they could, Gold Sarcophagus offered a huge advantage to those who had access to it. This card would end up getting its reprint in 2009. With Crush Card Virus banned by this point, this was still a good card, but which would only see play in decks that actually had something worth waiting 2 turns for. It was most popular in Lightsworn at first, since it was one of the best ways to get their boss monster, Judgment Dragon. This card would go on to also become a staple in X-Sabers, since the then limited Rescue Cat was one of the deck's best enablers, and countless other decks up until 2012 where it began to fall off. However, just as it became a tad too slow to wait 2 turns for anything, we also got cards with effects that triggered when they're banished. The Dragon Rulers were the first, but also one of the best at doing this. Each ruler gets you an ad off of being banished, making Gold Sarcophagus into a Rhoda with the added benefits 2 turns later. This would lead to Gold Sarcophagus being put on the limited list again, where it would still be run as a one-off in pretty much every list that ran Dragon Rulers. In 2015, this same year that Crush Card Virus came back to the meta through its errata, so would Gold Sarcophagus due to the new Dex release at the time. Both the Ritual Beast and Cosmos like having their monsters banished, making Gold Sarcophagus into a must-have. Eventually, in 2016, they unlimited the card, and in the later parts of the year it ended up becoming an important staple in certain decks. This was because of Shiranui Solitaire and Shiranui Spirit Master, which let you either special summon your banished Shiranuis and pop an opponent's card when banished respectively. When coupled with Giant Rex, which special summoned itself for free when banished, this meant that Gold Sarcophagus was a full toolbox by itself. This card would be allowed to take on this role up until the Thunder Dragon support came out, which had much stronger effects than banished, such as special summoning from the deck or adding any card from their archetype to their hand. This led to Gold Sarcophagus being put to 1 again, where it's been ever since. Even if the original reason why this card got hit might no longer be relevant, Gold Sarcophagus is still a great card that sees play as recently as this year due to its synergy with Despia as well. Overall, even if it might not have been impactful as Crush Card Virus back in its heyday, Gold Sarcophagus would still end up as the prize card which has seen the biggest amount of play throughout the years. It and Cyber-Stein are the only cards in this list to be limited to this day, and it's unlikely we'll ever see Gold Sarcophagus back at 3 again. Doomcaliber Knight was given to the top 3 players at 2008's SJCs. This is a level 4 Dark Fiend monster with 1900 attack and 1800 defense. It cannot be special summoned, and if a monster effect is activated, it tributes itself to negate and destroy that monster. Doomcaliber Knight has to be one of the earliest instances of a monster negate actually seen play in Yu-Gi-Oh! Its effect makes it quite similar to Light and Darkness Dragon in that it must negate any monster effect it sees, but unlike Light and Darkness Dragon, this one also destroys the monster that activated its effect as well. Though you do need to be careful because it will trigger on your own monsters too. When it was first given out, this card actually saw some experimentation in those same dad decks that had Crush Card Virus and Gold Sarcophagus due to being a decent dark monster, as if having 2 prize cards in the same deck wasn't enough. At least it was a tech and not a must play though. Even before its general release, this card would be generally outclassed as a beater with an upside by Thunder King Ryo, which was generally more useful and splashable. In any case, this card would see a fair bit of experimentation once most of the player base could actually use it, towards the end of 2009. It was played in the side deck to be brought onto matchups where you'd know they'd have to trade badly into it, like Gladiator Beasts and Lightsworns. It was risky to main it as other matchup cards like Treeborn Frog and Vayu could remove it for free. This card saw some play through the years from that point on, being seen mostly as an anti-meta card to hopefully slow your opponent down a bit. There'd be many meta staples where it would do well against from that point onwards, such as Rescue Rabbit and Tour Guide from the Underworld. It being a decent dark became relevant again with Konami unbanning Blackluster Soldier and Void of the Beginning. This card would last see play in 2015 as a decent normal summoned monster in pure Psy-frames. That deck always wanted an empty field to make sure the Psy-frames were alive, so it was nice that Doomcaliber Knight would eventually clear itself from the field. This monster has been severely power crept nowadays, as you can get a much better payoff for a normal summon in any other competent strategy. But it's one of those cards that would have surely seen a lot more play if it had been widely available at first. Finally, we have the last card to be given out at SJCs, Dark End Dragon. This is a level 8 Dark Dragon Synchro which takes any tuner plus 1 or more dark monsters. It has 2600 attack and 2100 defense and can, once per turn, target a monster your opponent controls and lose 500 attack and defense to send that card to the graveyard. This fittingly named card would represent the end of the Shonen Jump Championship Series, which would then be replaced by the Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series, or YCS. The main goal of this change was to make Yu-Gi-Oh! Tourneys into a global phenomenon. The game grew exponentially with time, and Konami now wanted a standard tourney format, which would take place not only in North America, but in Latin America and Europe as well. The last SJC to take place was in Edison, New Jersey, and that tournament's format is now the most played retro format in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the moment. Edison format, as it's called, has dethroned even GOAT format in popularity recently. Going back to the actual card, Dark End Dragon is a boss monster which can perform a very unique role for its time. Though this Synchro 8 pull included powerhouses like Stardust Dragon and Thought Ruler Arcfiend, none had actual removal effects like Dark End Dragon does. This card can be used to deal with powerful flip monsters like Raikou without triggering their effects. It could be used to stop chains of recruiters such as Mystic Tomato and even break the then dreaded Duplock. The only reason why this card wasn't played in every deck was due to the restriction in its materials on, and of course its availability. Nowadays, when people go back and play Edison format, Blackwings are often considered the best deck at the time, with zombie-focused strategies not far behind it. This card being available to everyone is certainly one of the reasons why these decks are considered to be much stronger now than they were historically. After this card stopped being exclusively a prize card in late 2010, it was still a decent option for removal in dark decks. However, now it had to compete with Scrap Dragon, which could pop 80 card rather than just monsters, and it had completely generic materials, making it into the better choice most of the time. Dark End Dragon marked the end of its era, and its prize card version remains as one of the most iconic and sought after gems for collectors to this day. Alright, and that's it for this episode of the Unknown Side of YuGiOh. Is there anything else we missed about these cards, or do you have any ideas for other topics you'd like to see covered in the series? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.